a country with more than 280 million people, accounting for nearly 40% of Southeast Asia's population, holding around 35 to 40% of the world's nickel reserves, and contributing close to half of ASEAN's digital economy value. If we look at each of these figures in isolation, we simply see a large emerging economy. But when we place them together, a very different picture begins to emerge. This is no longer just a developing country with a large population base. This is an economy gradually redefining its role in the global economic structure. Indonesia is shifting from a state of cyclical growth to structural growth. From being a major economy in Southeast Asia, Indonesia is steadily becoming a strategic link in the most important value chains of the 21st century, especially in new energy, deep manufacturing, and the digital economy. And this transformation raises a very important question. What makes Indonesia so special that it is not only a large economy, but also one capable of shaping the future of an entire region? Welcome back to the Roma's Economic Podcast. Roma's Economic Podcast delivers sharp insights and in-depth analysis on Southeast Asia's economy, Asia, and the constantly evolving global economic landscape. Our channel transforms complex economic narratives into clear, accessible, and value-rich content for a global audience, with a strong focus on the rise of Southeast Asia in the world economy. In today's episode, we will dive into one of the most important questions for the region over the coming decades. Why Indonesia could become the most important economy in Southeast Asia? To understand Indonesia, we cannot only look at growth rates or short-term indicators. We need to examine the deeper structure of its economy and how it connects to major global trends. Southeast Asia today is one of the most dynamic regions in the world. Vietnam has risen through manufacturing and exports. Thailand plays a central role in automotive production and tourism. Malaysia holds strengths in semiconductors and higher income development. The Philippines is strong in services and global labor markets. But Indonesia is a completely different case. Indonesia is not only the largest economy in the region, it is also the most internally self-sustained economy in Southeast Asia. Today, Indonesia's nominal GDP is around 1.3 trillion USD. On a purchasing power parity basis, it exceeds 4 trillion USDs. This places Indonesia among the largest economies in Asia, behind only China, India, and Japan. But the real importance is not in scale, but in how the economy functions internally. One of Indonesia's most important foundations is its population. With more than 280 million people, Indonesia is the most populous country in Southeast Asia and one of the most populous in the world. But the true strength does not come from size alone. It comes from structure. Around 70% of Indonesia's population is in the working age group. The median age is around 29 to 30 years. This creates what economists call a demographic window of opportunity. During this phase, the economy benefits from a labor force that grows faster than the dependent population. This creates natural advantages for growth because the workforce is dominant relative to non-working dependents. However, the more important effect is the chain reaction this creates. When the labor force is large, production expands. When production expands, incomes rise. When incomes rise, consumption increases. And when consumption increases, businesses expand investment further. This feedback loop creates a self-reinforcing growth cycle that can sustain long-term expansion without excessive dependence on external factors. This is why many international institutions view Indonesia as one of the most structurally stable long-term growth economies in the region. If population is the first foundation, then the domestic market is the second. Indonesia is one of the few major Asian economies with relatively low dependence on exports. Household consumption accounts for more than half of GDP. This creates a very important characteristic. The economy is driven strongly by internal demand. While many economies depend heavily on global trade cycles, Indonesia has a strong internal growth engine. This makes the economy more resilient during periods of global trade slowdown. During global crises, Indonesia typically does not fall into deep recession, but instead experiences a slowdown in growth rather than contraction. This has been observed across multiple economic cycles, including the global pandemic period. Domestic consumption acts as a natural buffer that stabilizes the economy in a volatile global environment. If population and domestic demand form the first foundation, then strategic natural resources form the second global pillar. Indonesia holds around 35 to 40% of global nickel reserves and is one of the world's largest nickel producers. However, the true value of nickel is not in the metal itself, but in its role in modern technology supply chains. Nickel is a critical component in lithium-ion batteries, especially those used in electric vehicles. In the context of the global transition from fossil fuels to electrification, nickel has become one of the most strategic raw materials in the world. This places Indonesia at the center of one of the fastest-growing industries globally. If oil defined the 20th century, nickel and battery metals may define the 21st century. The key difference is that economic power today is not only about resource ownership, but about positioning within global supply chains. More importantly, Indonesia is not only a resource holder, but also actively reshaping how it uses this advantage. Instead of exporting raw ores, Indonesia has shifted toward deep processing and industrial upgrading. The government has implemented restrictions on raw nickel exports, requiring companies to invest in refining and battery material production within the country. This has created a major structural shift in the economy. From a raw material exporter, Indonesia is becoming a regional hub for intermediate materials in the global energy industry. Large-scale industrial zones have emerged, especially in resource-rich areas such as Sulawesi. This not only increases export value, but more importantly, upgrades Indonesia's position in the global value chain. Indonesia is no longer just a resource supplier. It is becoming a strategic manufacturing base for the global energy transition. Alongside natural resources, Indonesia is also pushing rapid industrialization. The industrial strategy focuses on higher value-added sectors such as food processing, textiles, chemicals, automotive, and electronics. The goal is not simply higher output, but structural upgrading of the economy, from a low-cost labor model toward a productivity-driven, technology-integrated value chain model. Indonesia is building an industrial base that serves both global exports and its massive domestic market. Another rapidly growing pillar is the digital economy. Indonesia now has more than 200 million internet users, making it the largest digital market in Southeast Asia. The rapid growth of e-commerce, digital payments, and technology platforms has created a massive digital ecosystem. Platforms such as GoTo, Tokopedia, Traveloka, and various fintech services have reshaped everyday economic behavior. According to regional reports, Indonesia accounts for around 40 to 50% of ASEAN's total digital economy value. This clearly shows Indonesia's leadership role in the region's digital transformation. More importantly, the digital economy is no longer just a supporting sector, but a real growth engine. When all factors are combined, Indonesia is rising on three structural pillars. First, a large population and strong domestic market, creating stable organic growth. Second, strategic natural resource advantages within the global new energy supply chain. Third, industrialization combined with digital expansion, upgrading both scale and structure of the economy. This combination is what makes Indonesia one of the most closely watched economies in Asia. And if these trends continue over the coming decades, Indonesia may not only lead Southeast Asia in scale, but also become a major economic center, shaping the new global economic order. To sustain its current growth trajectory and maintain an increasingly important role in the Asian economy, Indonesia must overcome a series of deep structural challenges. These are not short-term issues that can be solved with minor policy adjustments. They are systemic bottlenecks tied directly to the country's long-term development foundation. They can be grouped into three major categories: infrastructure and logistics, human capital quality, and institutional framework, together with the investment environment. Each of these areas directly affects Indonesia's ability to sustain growth, move up the value chain, and attract long-term capital. The first challenge is infrastructure and logistics, which form the physical backbone of the entire economy. Indonesia is a geographically unique country made up of more than 17,000 islands. This creates a highly dispersed economic structure that is very different from countries with continuous landmass. In theory, this archipelagic structure offers advantages in terms of natural resources, regional diversity, and the potential for multiple growth centers. However, in modern economic practice, it creates one of the most complex challenges in terms of connectivity and logistics costs. At present, Indonesia's interregional transport and logistics system is still not fully integrated at the level required for a large-scale industrial economy. Regions such as Java are relatively well developed, hosting most of the country's industrial base, services, and administrative functions. However, many outer islands still rely heavily on sea and air transport, which increases overall logistics costs. This leads to a very important economic reality. Domestic logistics costs in Indonesia remain relatively high compared to regional benchmarks. In an economy where manufacturing and domestic trade are becoming increasingly important, high logistics costs directly reduce overall competitiveness. When transportation costs rise, product prices increase. When prices increase, businesses face stronger competitive pressure, especially in low-margin industries such as textiles, food processing, and light manufacturing. Beyond logistics, energy infrastructure is also a critical pressure point. Indonesia is experiencing rapid industrial expansion, which naturally drives strong growth in electricity demand. However, the power generation, transmission, and distribution systems are still expanding to catch up with actual demand growth. In development economics, energy is considered one of the most important binding constraints on long-term growth. An economy may have labor, capital, and natural resources, but without sufficient and stable energy supply, industrialization slows down. This is particularly important given Indonesia's ambition to attract more deep manufacturing and global supply chain industries, which require stable and affordable electricity. At the same time, digital infrastructure is also uneven across regions. While major urban centers are rapidly adopting e-commerce, fintech, and digital services, many rural and remote areas still lag behind in connectivity and access. This creates an internal development gap that affects not only social equality, but also economic productivity. In the long run, if this gap is not reduced, it could become a structural barrier to balanced national development. If infrastructure represents the physical foundation of the economy, then human capital represents the operational foundation. This leads to the second major challenge, the quality of the labor force. Indonesia has a significant advantage in terms of population size, with more than 280 million people, making it one of the largest labor markets in the world. However, the issue is not quantity, but quality and consistency. There is a noticeable disparity in skill levels across regions. In major urban centers such as Jakarta, Surabaya, and Bandung, the workforce is relatively more skilled, particularly in services, finance, and technology-related sectors. However, in many rural and remote areas, the labor force remains largely concentrated in low-skilled occupations. This creates a clear productivity gap between regions. In economics, labor productivity is one of the most critical determinants of long-term growth. A country can grow quickly in the short term through abundant low-cost labor, but sustained long-term growth requires continuous improvements in productivity. The second dimension of this challenge is the shortage of high-skilled labor. As Indonesia moves deeper into industrialization and global value chain integration, the demand for engineers, technical specialists, researchers, and R&D professionals is rising rapidly. However, the supply of high-skilled talent has not kept pace with this demand. This creates a structural gap in the transition from a labor-intensive economy to a knowledge and technology-driven economy. If this gap is not addressed, Indonesia may struggle to move up the global value chain. Instead of advancing into higher value activities such as design, innovation, and advanced manufacturing, the economy could become stuck in mid or low value segments. The third challenge lies in institutions and the investment environment, which play a decisive role in shaping long-term capital flows. In recent years, Indonesia has implemented a series of reforms aimed at improving the business climate and attracting foreign direct investment. These reforms have helped stabilize and increase FDI inflows, particularly in manufacturing and resource-based industries. However, for international investors, the key concern is not only market opportunity, but also policy stability, transparency, and predictability. At present, certain issues remain within the institutional framework. Administrative procedures in some sectors are still relatively complex, licensing processes can take time, and there are noticeable differences in policy implementation across regions. This creates a certain level of uncertainty for long-term investment decisions, especially for large-scale projects with long payback periods. In the global economy, long-term capital tends to prioritize stability over short-term returns. As a result, any factor that reduces policy predictability can affect the quality of investment inflows. Another important aspect is governance efficiency and transparency. As an economy expands rapidly, the demand for effective governance increases accordingly. If institutions do not evolve at the same pace as economic growth, resource allocation can become inefficient, reducing overall economic performance. On the other hand, improved governance can act as a growth multiplier, ensuring that capital and resources are allocated more efficiently across sectors and regions. When all three groups of challenges are considered together, a clear pattern emerges. Indonesia is not lacking in potential, market size, or natural resources. However, transforming these advantages into sustained long-term growth requires simultaneous progress across three structural dimensions: infrastructure and logistics to reduce costs and improve connectivity, human capital development to enhance productivity and competitiveness, institutional strengthening to ensure stable and efficient capital allocation. These are not short-term problems. They are generational challenges that require sustained reform and long-term investment. Ultimately, the way Indonesia addresses these three challenges will determine whether it remains simply a large regional economy or evolves into a major economic hub with deep influence in the new economic architecture of Asia over the coming decades.